Awesome! Seems useful.
Yep.
Nice!
Looking for that special loaf? Look no further. I've got all sorts of items.
I got you. Excuse me.
It can't hurt just to look around. What have you got to lose? Daddy's ain't got nothing on you.
Excuse me.
Buy from me and you'll agree. This brand is the bee's knees.
Hey, friend, what can I help you find?
Veggies for sale. Pumpkins. Daddy's ain't got nothing on you. Discount free. Buy one, get one free.
Buy from me and you'll ever taste this brand. Try a bee's knees.
Welcome.
Hey, so
Yes.
good day.
Once upon a time, in a land far away, there was a lone swordsman famed for his two-sword style. He became a legend after fighting over 10,000 battles, and the mere sound of his name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Whenever he appeared in town, ne'er-do-wells were said to scramble away like spiders fleeing the light. Prospective fighters began to seek out the swordsman, and thus he gained quite the following of disciples. Amongst them, some were so strong they could crush warships with a single strike. One could do worse when choosing students of the martial arts. So the master abandoned the battlefield for the mountains, where he could train his beloved disciples in peace. There was one disciple who quickly stood leagues above the rest. It took her only a matter of days to master the most complicated techniques. She grew at an astonishing rate into one of the most powerful fighters the master had ever seen. But more impressive than her wits or her aptitude was the strength of her conviction. Every day the top disciple begged for harder training, and the master was willing to reward her passion with the very depths of his knowledge. And that's why... Oh, skies help me. That's why when the master found out his top disciple had betrayed him, he was filled with anguish. She went rogue, forcing some of the other disciples to do her bidding. Eventually, the master caught up with her, and they fought a deadly battle. When the dust settled, the top disciple's sword arm hung limp and unusable. It was a bittersweet victory, as the master knew what must come next. He readied his blade, preparing to release her to the afterlife, but he couldn't force himself to make the cut. Not after all he had poured into this girl. Not after failing her so. Thus, he laid down his weapon and promised to live his remaining days in penance and regret. Oh, how our good intentions cloud even the most prescient vision. Having thrown away his name, his blade, and his path, he set out back into the world. But this time, swearing no one would suffer from his tutelage again. Time passed, and the swordsman found himself atop a different mountain, where he learned he had a knack for fishing. Suited him just fine. Bass for breakfast, salmon for supper, and naps in between. Yep, it suited him just fine. It was the quiet, healing life of a hermit. Sometimes, when he needed supplies, he would go down to the village and train the locals in a little sword work. That made his coin purse jingle again. But this peace wasn't to last for the swordsman. He discovered his top disciple was back to her wicked ways, and, sword in hand, he vowed to conclude her story for good. This was his true purpose for traveling with the crew, though the young captain never suspected the little Harvan fisherman was harboring such a dark secret. The former disciple's latest victim had been a simple man from a remote mountain area, cut down, somehow without the use of her sword. A real shame that one more innocent life lost before its time. The swordsman asked the crew to make haste to the village. When he saw the murdered man's corpse, such was the carnage that he could barely keep from averting his eyes. It was his weakness, his cowardice, that cost this poor man's life. But this time, instead of wallowing in pity, he would don his white uniform of old and atone. He called it his burial garb, and it represented his fearlessness on the battlefield. If he were dressed to meet death face to face, what more could his foes do to intimidate him? Of course, his crewmates tried to reason with him, concerned he might throw his life away to make up for the wrongdoing of another. But the Swordmaster was determined. He had vowed to stop his former disciple, whatever risk that entailed. So, when finally the moment of reckoning had come, the Master gripped his blade, ready to strike down his favored pupil. Before he could do the deed, however, his resolve crumbled. His emotions were too strong, dulling his senses and causing him to lose the match. The Master's former youngest disciple, with his two newest pupils watching from the sidelines, rushed to aid him. Ironically, it was the youngest disciple who struck down the fiend in place of the Master. The swordsman was lost in grief, but his newfound champion told him this was for the best. After all, such an old life deserved the rest of its days to be spent in peace. After joining up with the crew, I've had some helter-skelter days, let me tell you. So when we arrived in Grande, I knew I needed to get myself some fishing done. Reset the old noggin. Found a nice, quiet pond and dropped my line. Bless me taters. Must have been hours past with no bite. Finally, I decided to pull up my rod and check if the bait was still hardy. But there weren't no baits, no hook, and no fish. Only a lonely little bobber remained on the line. Right, well, what about me traps? I was halfway through the search when I realized, blast, I left them in the lodge. What a day, what a day. But it was too late in the noon to go back for them, and I had other business to attend to, like getting back to the pond and staring out at the clear water. In that moment of stillness, the fishies swam out of their hiding spots. There were big ones and little ones, and the whole school of them reminded me of my teaching days. Each of my disciples was unique in their own right. Had me some slow learners and some fast ones, some goody two-shoes and some real punks. I learned me some good lessons from those kids. My top student, Grace, never wavered in her particular sense of justice, and her commitment to her training was ironclad. What a waste. Rains, my youngest pupil, lost his way for decades after leaving my tutelage, but he ended up killing Grace in my stead. He was selfless, thinking only of his master. They say the master extracts potential from the student, but I fear I've ruined more young lives than I've helped. Makes a fisherman wonder how they all would have turned out had he just kept well enough to himself. I turned Grace into a monster. Not a day goes by I don't regret honing her skills. Unfortunately, she had the gift and the gumption to go far, and I exhausted all my knowledge on her. If only I had focused more on the why of my teachings rather than the what. Huh? I swore I felt a nibble at my rod, but when I pulled it up, there was nothing to be found. That's when I remembered I still hadn't hooked or baited the line. That was odd. I was getting antsy. Maybe it was because I forgot the traps, but I couldn't relax just sitting there anymore. I decided to pack up and head back into town. You see, the mind is like a creek. You want to keep it healthy. You gotta keep the waters from stagnating. But churn them too much, and you risk losing all your fish. I decided to head to Sierra's shack and replace some fishing gear, hopefully restoring my brain pond in the process. But just as I was dipping my toes into the placid waters of the lures and bait, I heard a rustle from behind. And to my surprise, they were my crewmates, picking up a package. Said they were bored at the inn and asked if they could come fishing with me. Youngsters so bored they wanted to go fishing? First time for everything, huh? While I was hammering out the finer points of fly casting with the captain, Sierra Carte piped up. Said she'd come across a pretty tasty rumor.
Yep, apparently there's a legendary fisherman in the Skydom that people have started calling the Fishergod.
I'd heard rumors like this one before, and they always stank like fish guts. Catching 10 fish with one cast, netting a whole consortium of crabs. By yourself? Gah! If I had a fin for every story like this, I'd be a pretty scary sea monster by now. Then again, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued. There's a scale of truth to every story, so there must be a reason they call this person the Fishergod. Guess you might say my interest was piqued. Because if this fella were half as good as me, he'd make a mighty fine rival. And maybe that's just what I needed.